imagine a world, just for a moment, where traditional male virtues, things like stoicism, assertiveness, a drive for physical strength, and a protective instinct,
Right.
where those are no longer seen as the building blocks of civilization, but are instead diagnosed as clinical diseases.
Which is a wild concept to even visualize.
It really is. I mean,
Uh,
imagine a society where boys are heavily medicated simply for acting like boys, and where, in response to all of this, a massive, quiet counterculture of men is actively unplugging from modern life to build completely off-grid parallel institutions.
Yeah.
Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm so glad you are joining us for this one because we are navigating some truly explosive territory today.
We really are. The landscape we are exploring today is highly complex, and it touches on some of the most contentious cultural debates of our time.
Absolutely. But before we get into the material, just a quick reminder for you to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive.
Always important.
Yeah. Today's discussion is a comprehensive review of a highly provocative new ebook that is making huge waves right now. We strongly urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy this book.
And you'll definitely want to read it for yourself after this.
For sure. And also make sure to follow the author at Conrad Reicher at his Substack. The book is Conrad Reicher's 2025 release, Hysterical Harm, Overprotection Creates Mental Illness.
No, I think it is critical, really critical, that we set the context for exactly what kind of book this is before we look at the specific arguments.
Yeah, that is an important point. This is a radical, unapologetic text. I mean, it is written specifically for men's rights and quote-unquote red-pilled audience.
Right.
The author's stated goal is to understand the history of modern institutions through the lens of their alleged capture by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
He's laying it all out.
He is. He is trying to explain how we arrived at our current cultural moment, and he does not pull any punches.
Which brings us to a vital impartiality disclaimer for you, the listener.
Yes, very important.
The source material we are covering today contains highly politically charged content. And we want to explicitly state right up front that we are absolutely not taking sides today.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the ideologies presented in this book.
Our mission today is purely to impartially report on the content provided to us. We're here to unpack the author's arguments, examine his evidence, and, just help you deeply understand the worldview contained in this specific text.
Exactly. We are acting as your guides through the material.
So, to set the stage, let's look at the core thesis of the text.
Yeah, let's jump in. The author argues that the modern mental health crisis among men is not a crisis of chemistry.
Right, it's not biological.
Exactly. It is not fundamentally about brain imbalances or serotonin levels. Instead, he views it as a crisis of meaning brought on by systemic overprotection and a concept he refers to as gynocentrism.
Gynocentrism.
Yeah. The underlying premise here is that modern society has pathologized strength and glorified weakness, framing traditional masculinity as a problem to be solved, rather than, say, a force to be channeled.
Okay, so the book starts by illustrating what the author sees as a complete collapse of resilience in the modern generation.
Yeah, and he uses a pretty striking story to do that.
He really does. There is an opening anecdote about a time he was speaking at a university. He describes a college student raising his hand and genuinely asking, and this is a quote, "How do I deal with someone who disagrees with me without feeling attacked?"
Wow.
Yeah. So how does the author frame this interaction? Because, is he presenting it as an outlier? Just one weird kid?
He explicitly states that this wasn't satire and it wasn't an isolated incident.
The student was serious.
Entirely serious. And the author views this moment as the inevitable end product of a system that raises boys in a state of total emotional insulation.
Emotional insulation. That's an interesting phrase.
Right. The argument constructed in the text is that when you protect feelings at all costs, prioritizing emotional comfort over intellectual friction, you end up with young men who genuinely do not know how to process disagreement without suffering an emotional collapse.
Because they've never had to.
Exactly. And he traces this back to very specific institutional shifts in how we define mental health.
Okay, so what are the specific shifts he points to? Because he claims that traditional male traits have been systematically medicalized. But what is the historical anchor for that argument? Where does he say this started?
He points to a psychological report from 1992.
1992.
Yeah, the text argues that this report officially pathologized traditional male gender roles. It slapped the label of toxic on traits like discipline, stoicism, and assertiveness.
Just completely reframe them.
Right. The author suggesting that virtually overnight, the very virtues that historically built civilizations, the ability to delay gratification, the suppression of outward emotion in times of crisis, the drive for hierarchical dominance.
The things that used to be praised.
Exactly, they were recast as psychological diseases. He argues that therapists began diagnosing boys with repressed emotions simply for not externalizing their feelings in a manner traditionally associated with female communication styles.
Wow. So they were being judged by a completely different metric.
Yes.
But he doesn't just rely on theoretical framing for this, right? He brings in quantitative data regarding the medicalization of young men.
He does. He brings receipts.
What are the specific numbers he uses to back this up?
The primary data point he leverages is a massive spike in ADHD diagnoses.
Okay.
He points out that between 2003 and 2011, ADHD diagnoses in boys spiked by 43%.
43% in less than a decade.
Yeah, and he explicitly links this to fatherless homes and argues that schools started medicating natural male energy and competitiveness.
Just drugging them to keep them quiet.
Basically, he refers to this as correlation with causation buried under layers of ideological noise.
That's a heavy croak.
It is. The thesis is that instead of altering the environment to suit the high energy needs of young boys, institutions chose to alter the brain chemistry of the boys to suit the sedentary, compliant environment of the modern classroom.
Let's look closer at that classroom environment, actually, because that seems to be a major battleground in the book.
Oh, absolutely.
How does the text describe the mechanical operation of modern schools when it comes to managing male behavior?
He references the 1994 Gun-Free Schools Act, which introduced zero-tolerance policies nationwide.
Right, zero tolerance. We all remember when that started.
Yeah, and in the author's view, these policies turn schools into environments deeply hostile to boyhood.
Hostile how?
He argues that under zero tolerance, context is entirely removed from discipline.
Oh, okay.
So, roughhousing, competitive play, or even physical self-defense, all of that is stripped of its intent and universally categorized as forbidden aggression.
And he illustrates this with a very specific case from 2017 in Colorado.
Yes, the Colorado case.
According to the book, a boy was physically attacked by a female student. And the text notes, the boy didn't initiate the fight and didn't escalate it.
He was just standing there.
Right, he simply defended himself from the physical attack. But because of these zero tolerance policies, he was punished alongside the attacker.
Exactly the same punishment.
So does the author view this as just, bureaucratic laziness or something more intentional?
He views it as highly intentional.
Really?
Yeah, his conclusion here is that in the new moral order, the male instinct for physical protection is viewed strictly as unacceptable aggression.
So the very act of defending yourself is toxic.
Right. He writes that, quote, violence is never acceptable unless, of course, the perpetrator wears a skirt.
Wow.
Yeah, the broader argument he is making about the state's role in child rearing is that society no longer raises boys, it merely manages them.
Manages them. What is the distinction he draws between raising and managing?
It's a key distinction for him. Raising a child, in his framework, involves moral authority, usually derived from a father's presence.
Okay. It involves teaching lessons with relational depth.
Like actually molding their character.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Managing a child, conversely, is bureaucratic. It relies on medication, standardized punishments like timeouts, and the suppression of disruption.
Just keeping the assembly line moving.
Yes. He essentially views natural male behavior as a blank space that modern institutions try to medicate away and fill with female-centric values.
So if we follow his logic that institutions are managing rather than raising boys, it begs the question of what underlying philosophy is actually driving these institutions.
Right, there has to be a framework.
And the text introduces a concept called safetyism. How does the author define this term?
Safetyism is really central to his worldview.
Okay.
He defines it as the ideological shift, where safety is no longer about physical protection, but has morphed into a tool for emotional and ideological control.
Emotional safety.
Exactly. It is the belief that individuals must be protected not just from physical harm, but from words, ideas, and uncomfortable realities. And he uses the 2015 Yale University Halloween costume controversy to illustrate this.
Yes, a perfect example of his point.
The baseline facts of that event are pretty well known. Administrative email advising students on culturally sensitive costumes, a pushback email from lecturer Erica Christakis suggesting students should police themselves.
Right, suggesting they act like adults.
Yeah. And then the subsequent massive student protests demanding her removal.
Yeah, screaming at her husband in the courtyard.
Exactly. But how does this text interpret the underlying mechanics of that outrage?
The author argues that the outrage wasn't actually about student safety at all.
What was it about?
In his view, it was about institutional control and the weaponization of victimhood.
The weaponization of victimhood.
Yeah. He notes how he watched peers self-censor and drop out of intellectual debates entirely just to avoid being labeled a threat to someone's emotional safety.
So the fear of being called unsafe silences you.
Right. He frames this as a full-scale reversal of Enlightenment values, where objective truth and free inquiry are made subordinate to emotional comfort.
But the argument doesn't stop at university campuses, though.
No, it spreads.
Right. He claims this ideological capture has spread to entities that historically demand the highest levels of stoicism and merit, like the military and the corporate tech world.
Two very different arenas.
Very different. What examples does he pull to demonstrate this expansion? Let's start with the military.
For the military, he brings up a 2021 U.S. Army training mandate.
Okay.
According to the book, soldiers were taught that traditional masculinity is toxic and that white male identity is inherently oppressive.
In the Army.
In the Army. He views this as catastrophic because the military is an institution fundamentally built on hierarchy, duty, and the willingness to engage in physical violence on behalf of the state.
Right. You need aggression in combat.
Exactly. To introduce an ideology that pathologizes the very traits required for combat is, in his eyes, not an attempt at reform, but a deliberate re-education program designed to weaken the institution from within.
That's a huge claim. And then he also spends significant time on the corporate sphere, specifically the 2017 firing of Google engineer James Damore.
Yes, the Google memo.
Damore wrote an internal memo citing peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology studies, suggesting that biological differences might explain some of the gender disparities in tech, rather than purely systemic discrimination.
Which was incredibly controversial.
Huge fallout. What is the author's takeaway from how Google leadership handled that memo?
He uses the Damore incident as proof that logic, competence, and open inquiry have been entirely replaced by what he calls the algorithm of outrage and forced compliance.
The algorithm of outrage.
Yeah. According to the text, Google leadership didn't debate the underlying science of Damore's memo. They simply terminated him.
They didn't engage with the argument.
No. The author argues this demonstrates that if you do not signal the correct ideological virtues, your technical competence is completely irrelevant.
You could be the best coder in the world, but if you step out of line...
You are excised from the system.
So, if the military and corporate spheres are already captured, the text argues we have to look at the source of this ideology, which he says is the education system.
Right. That's where it all begins.
He introduces the phrase, the decolonization of education.
Yes.
To explain this, he points to a 2018 National Education Association video from their social justice educator program. In it, a teacher wearing a decolonized math shirt argues that objective standards in mathematics are tools of white supremacy. How does the author dissect that specific claim? Because that sounds absurd on its face to a lot of people.
He points to this as the logical endpoint of a movement that, in his words, hates truth, hierarchy, and merit.
Hates truth.
Right. The teacher in the video argued that stating there is only a single correct way to solve a math equation reinforces dominant, oppressive cultural narratives.
So saying 2 plus 2 is 4 is oppressive.
Exactly. And the author asks a fundamental question. If the concept that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is considered oppressive, what is the actual purpose of the education system?
What are we even doing here?
He connects this to modern pedagogical standards that require students to advocate for equity, arguing that classrooms are no longer spaces for academic learning, but have been transformed into revolutionary cells for ideological training.
Revolutionary cells. And he extrapolates this with a couple of other examples from the text to show how widespread this is.
Yes, he has a few case studies.
He mentions an Oregon teacher dismissed in 2023 for teaching Plato's Republic alongside critical race theory materials.
Right.
The teacher's goal was apparently to help students compare how different societies understand justice. But the district allegedly fired him for permitting equity frameworks to be critically examined rather than blindly accepted.
And he pairs that with an example from Virginia, where a school district reportedly removed Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland from a reading list due to themes of identity confusion, while simultaneously mandating modules on gender fluidity.
The contradiction there is wild.
The author uses these contrasting examples to solidify his thesis that schools have entirely swapped structure, logical inquiry, and academic rigor for emotional validation. high integration of critical race theory saw a 22% decline in math and reading performance.
22%, that's massive.
Huge. For him, this decline isn't an accidental byproduct. It is the deliberate production of obedient followers who can recite intersectional theory but lack basic foundational academic skills.
This transitions into what feels like a massive escalation in the book's argument.
Yeah, the tone really shifts here.
The author moves from critiquing how we are taught to think to critiquing how institutions are forcing us to perceive physical reality itself.
Physical reality.
Right. He anchors this argument in a 2023 high school biology textbook used in Texas. What specifically did he find in this textbook that serves as a turning point in his thesis?
He describes examining this textbook and discovering that every historical instance of the words male and female had been replaced with the phrases assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth.
Every single instance.
Every single one. And he views this as a definitive line in the sand.
Does he view this as a definitive line in the sand?
Does he view this simply as an attempt by the publishers to be more linguistically inclusive? Just updating the language?
Not at all. He views it as a deliberate, calculated demolition of biological reality.
Demolition.
Yes. He writes that it is indoctrination disguised as science. The argument is that by changing the language at the foundational level of biology education, the state is enforcing a manufactured symmetry while demanding that students ignore genetics, evolutionary psychology, and observable reality.
The text argues that this erasure of the biological anchor isn't just an abstract philosophical issue, but that it has terrifying real-world consequences. Yeah, physical consequences.
Particularly regarding physical safety. What are the specific examples he provides to ground this claim?
He focuses heavily on the impact within women's shelters.
Okay.
He points to a 2016 ruling by the Ontario Human Rights Commission that mandated women's shelters must admit self-identified transgender women regardless of their biological sex.
And what happened?
According to the text, this legal mandate led to Canada's oldest battered women's shelter losing its government funding and permanently closing because the staff refused to comply with the directive.
They shut down the whole shelter.
It did.
And he follows that with an even more intense incident from 2020 at the Ottawa Women's Shelter.
Yes.
According to the book, a biological male with a documented history of violence against women was admitted to the shelter as a woman.
Right.
This reportedly triggered immediate resignations among the staff.
The author includes a highly revealing quote from a counselor at that shelter who spoke to him off the record.
What did she say?
The counselor stated, "I didn't sign up to protect men from other men while pretending they're unicorns."
Wow, that is blunt.
Very blunt. The author uses this incident to argue that the prevailing ideology demands society sacrifice common sense and actual physical safety on the altar of ideological purity.
So the ideology comes before the actual safety of the women.
He argues that forcing society to unsee what we know prioritizes subjective identity over empirical reality.
The author then takes this critique of how institutions ignore reality and applies it directly to the legal and human resources systems.
This is where his gynocentrism theory really solidifies.
He introduces a concept he calls the myth of female innocence as a cornerstone of this argument. How does he claim the legal system has been inverted?
He argues that the foundational Western legal concept of the presumption of innocence has been structurally inverted and replaced by the presumption of male guilt.
Presumption of male guilt. That's a huge claim to make against the entire legal system.
To build this case, he targets feminist legal theorists, specifically naming Catherine McKinnon.
Okay, Catherine McKinnon. What is his specific critique of her legal philosophy?
He unpacks her arguments over the past few decades, claiming that she and allied legal theorists have successfully argued that the process of cross-examination in court is itself a form of violence against women.
Cross-examination is violence.
That's the theory. The underlying idea is that requiring a woman to rigorously prove an accusation of assault re-traumatizes her.
Okay, I follow that logic.
Therefore, the author argues, these theorists have effectively pushed to ban skepticism and due process in accusations against men.
And how does he see this playing out outside of the criminal courts? Does he believe this philosophy has bled into the corporate world, like HR?
Absolutely. He views this shift as replacing objective law with subjective theology, where emotion and accusation trump hard evidence.
The HR departments are basically acting like these tribunals.
Right. He argues that this she said, he said standard has deeply infiltrated corporate HR departments and university Title IX's offices.
And what's the result of that?
In his view, this infrastructure hands angry or unstable individuals a nuclear key to destroy men's careers and reputations without the burden of due process.
A nuclear key.
Yeah. He frames these unvetted accusations not as random events or misunderstandings, but as symbolic executions designed to isolate and destroy male excellence under the banner of equality.
It is an incredibly dark view of modern legal and corporate structures.
Very bleak.
And the author believes this overarching system is specifically designed to produce a certain type of compliant individual. He calls this the engineered beta male.
The engineered beta male.
Right. How does he define this term, and how does it differ from traditional understandings of male hierarchy? Because we've all heard alpha and beta before.
He makes a very distinct point here. He argues that modern society isn't naturally producing weaker men due to a lack of physical hardship.
Like the whole hard times create strong men thing.
Right, he's saying it's not just a passive result of comfort. Rather, it is actively and intentionally socially engineering them to be dependent, compliant, and emotionally volatile.
Socially engineering.
Yes. He doesn't view the beta male as a biological inevitability, but as a manufactured product of the institutions we've discussed.
He shares a story about a software engineer named Dan at Google to illustrate how this engineering works in practice.
Dan's story is wild.
Yeah. Dan apparently had a flawless 4.9 out of 5 performance rating. His code was highly rated, and his contributions to the company's bottom line were measurable. But he was denied a promotion. Why?
According to the text, Dan was denied the promotion because he refused to participate in a gender pronoun circle.
A gender pronoun circle.
Yeah, where employees were expected to share personal stories of their gender identity journey.
And he just didn't want to do it.
Right. Because he declined to participate in the expected emotional signaling, HR labeled him culturally misaligned.
Culturally misaligned, despite being a top performer.
For the author, Dan's story is the ultimate proof that technical competence is no longer the currency of the modern corporate ladder. Compliance is the only currency that matters. The system doesn't reward problem solvers or innovators. It rewards those who perform the required ideological penitence.
Does the author argue that this dynamic is restricted to the workplace, or does he see it playing out in interpersonal relationships as well?
He argues it deeply impacts interpersonal dynamics, particularly the dating market.
How so?
He pulls data from OkCupid in 2022 to demonstrate this. The data showed that men who use terms like empathetic, sensitive, and spiritual journey in their dating profiles received 40% more matches than men who used more traditional descriptors.
40% more matches for saying you're sensitive, so the behavior is actually being rewarded by the market. What is the author's warning regarding this data?
He warns that algorithms and social structures are actively rewarding what he calls the beta performance.
The beta performance.
Yeah, men are internalizing the lesson that to be seen, to be hired, and to be dated, they must make themselves small, soft, and overly apologetic.
They have to put on a mask.
Exactly. He contrasts this highly curated online performance with the things men typically do not post online anymore. Fixing engines, leading teams in austere environments, building physical structures.
Because that's seen as toxic now.
Because the modern system no longer validates traditional, rugged utility.
The book then traces the root cause of this societal shift back to the breakdown of the family unit, specifically focusing on the erasure of fathers.
This is a massive part of his argument.
What are the historical statistics he uses to frame this decline?
The statistics he provides are stark. He notes that in the year 1900, 98% of American children lived with both biological parents.
98%.
Today, according to the text, that number has plummeted to 46%.
46%. That's less than half. Does he view this simply as the result of changing cultural norms and the advent of no-fault divorce? Or does he see a more deliberate dismantling at play?
He views it as a deliberate dismantling by ideological forces embedded within the legal system. He points specifically to the Uniform Parental Rights Act of 1973. He argues that this legislation and the case law that followed it effectively built a maternal preference into the bedrock of the family court system.
And he aggressively attacks what he calls the myth of maternal instinct. What does he mean by that?
He is challenging the legal assumption that women are biologically programmed to be superior caregivers, while men must be actively trained to nurture.
Okay.
He notes that family courts currently award primary custody to mothers 72% of the time, arguing that this discrepancy is not based on the individual fitness of the parents, but on an ingrained systemic bias against fathers.
The text also looks at how the state is stepping in to fill the void left by these absent fathers, specifically critiquing laws regarding parental consent. He focuses heavily on California's Assembly Bill 665.
AB 665.
This law do, and why does the author view it as a threat?
California AB 665 allows children over the age of 12 to consent to state-funded mental health care without the permission or even the knowledge of their parents.
A 12-year-old.
Yes. The author argues that laws like this represent a massive overreach of state power, effectively severing parental authority.
Because the state is bypassing the parents entirely.
He views this as an attack specifically on paternal authority, arguing that fathers are being systematically locked out of the most intimate medical and psychological decisions regarding their children.
Just completely sidelined.
He concludes that the state is reducing fathers to what he calls ATM machines, legally and financially responsible for the child, but intentionally rendered emotionally and morally irrelevant to the child's actual upbringing.
At this point in the text, the diagnosis of the problem concludes, and the author pivots dramatically to his prescription.
Yeah, the whole tone of the book changes here.
The final third of the book moves away from critique and focuses entirely on action. It's titled, Rebuilding the Citadel, the Red Pill Awakening.
Right.
He describes a phenomenon he calls the Great Walking Away. What is the scale of this movement he's documenting?
He provides a staggering statistic to illustrate the beginnings of this awakening. He claims that in 2023 alone, 18,000 American men legally disclaimed paternity after DNA tests revealed they had been financially supporting and raising children that were not biologically theirs.
18,000. That's a huge number.
The author refers to this mass legal action as a mutiny against a fundamentally unjust system.
He tells a highly specific story about a man named Mark in Indiana to ground this statistic.
Mark's story is central to this section.
According to the book, Mark had been paying $1,200 a month in child support for 8 years. When his ex-wife finally admitted the child was not biologically his, the family court still ruled that he was financially on the hook until the child turned 18 because a psychological bond had been formed.
Yeah, a bond formed by deception.
How did Mark respond to this ruling, and why does the author hold him up as an archetype?
Mark's response is the physical embodiment of the author's red pill philosophy. Mark didn't continue to appeal within a system he viewed as rigged, and he didn't wait for legislative reform.
He didn't just write letters to his congressman.
No. Instead, he filed for bankruptcy, legally unburdened himself as much as possible, moved across state lines to Ohio, and joined a tiny home village built by a Navy veteran.
Just completely unplugged.
The text notes that this village operates as a Christian discipleship community specifically for displaced fathers and their kids.
And there is a legal strategy embedded in this community, right? It's not just a commune.
Yes. They cleverly bypass local zoning laws by legally incorporating the land as a religious retreat.
That's brilliant.
Every weekend, these men gather to cook over open fires, study scripture, and, crucially, train each other in legal defense strategies. They're completely removing themselves from the mainstream societal grid.
That theme of pushing back through organization rather than just complaining is a massive part of this final section. Let's look at the group he highlights in Texas. Dads Against Divorce Courts. How did they operate and what were their results?
The author notes that this group started simply as a WhatsApp chat among frustrated fathers.
Like so many groups do.
Right. However, instead of just venting, they began pooling their financial resources. They used these pooled funds to hire aggressive, high-tier legal representation instead of relying on court-assigned mediators who they felt were biased against them.
And what happened when they organized like that?
The text claims that last year, this organized group won 67% of their contested custody cases.
67%.
The author's takeaway is emphatic. When men stop participating in the culture war as isolated victims and start organizing as a collective, they can actively defeat the institutions aligned against them.
This leads to the author's documentation of an entirely parallel society being built underground. He claims men are taking their technical skills and physical labor and walking away from mainstream institutions to build their own networks based entirely on traditional virtues.
A completely parallel economy.
Who are some of the key figures he highlights in this parallel economy?
He provides a wide array of examples to show the global nature of this movement. He mentions a Toronto roofer named Dan.
Okay, another Dan.
Yeah. Dan was apparently targeted online and accused of toxic masculinity for something he posted. His response was to completely ignore the online mob and start an organization called Brotherhood Build.
Brotherhood Build.
It's a crew of tradesmen who renovate homes for single mothers for free. They do not seek press. They don't have a GoFundMe. They just do quiet, physical work as a demonstration of traditional male utility.
He also mentions international examples, like the Underground Father Network in Sydney, which allegedly teaches men how to legally protect themselves from false allegations and how to raise their kids off the digital grid.
He also points to highly individualistic examples of walking away. There's the story of a father in Tasmania who, after losing custody of his children over a text message dispute, built a completely self-sustaining cabin with solar power and rainwater collection, effectively removing himself from the taxable economy.
Just dropping out completely.
Then there's Derek Thompson, who the author claims left a highly lucrative Silicon Valley tech job in 2019 to live off-grid in Alaska.
Trading Silicon Valley for Alaska.
The author notes that Thompson traded the anxiety of optimizing digital algorithms for the tangible peace of optimizing firewood stacks and surviving the winter.
But the author is very clear that this isn't just a few isolated guys living in the woods, right? He discusses what he calls the digital and physical citadels, claiming the scale of this movement is massive. What kind of numbers is he associating with this parallel society?
He claims there are currently 850,000 men organized on digital platforms like the Red Pill Realms and the Iron Forum.
Almost 1 million men.
He stresses that these forums are not spaces for complaining about women or modern society. Instead, they operate as strict accountability networks where men push each other to read classical philosophy like Seneca, lift heavier weights, learn physical combat skills, and become better, more present fathers.
And this digital infrastructure is translating into physical spaces as well. He mentions Iron Citadel gyms. What makes these different from a standard commercial gym?
According to the text, these gyms require an application to join. They combine heavy, brutal strength training with mandatory philosophy lectures on thinkers like Ludwig von Mises and St. Augustine.
Lifting weights and reading Augustine.
It is a fusion of physical capability and intellectual rigor. He also highlights the St. Michael Fellowship in Idaho, which is driving a parallel church movement.
Parallel churches now.
These are male-only religious services focused heavily on the concepts of spiritual warfare and household leadership. They entirely reject the inclusive, softened language of modern mainstream theology in favor of raw, unedited scripture.
Perhaps the most fascinating example of institutional replacement in the book is the New Athens Initiative in Tennessee. What is the educational model they are utilizing?
They are a private, all-male academy that is resurrecting the classical trivium education model.
What exactly does the trivium entail, and why does the author see it as the ultimate rebellion against modern education?
The trivium is the foundational structure of classical education, consisting of 3 parts: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. It teaches a student how to think, not what to think. First, you learn the fundamental rules and facts of a subject, which is grammar. Then, you learn how to analyze those facts and identify fallacies, which is logic. Finally, you learn how to persuasively articulate your synthesized conclusions, the rhetoric.
So it's the exact opposite of the emotional safety models.
The author views this as the antithesis to modern emotional reasoning. These young men are reading Cicero in the original Latin, deeply debating the theology of Thomas Aquinas, and literally forging knives in a blacksmith shop on the campus.
The text notes that they operate with 0 diversity quotas and absolutely no DEI training.
Yeah.
It is purely the pursuit of objective truth and physical virtue.
Right.
The author claims that when a local newspaper attempted to smear the academy as an extremist training camp, their enrollment applications actually doubled.
Which just proves his point about the demand for this. If we synthesize the author's ultimate takeaway from all this evidence, the framework he is constructing is profound.
It really is.
He argues forcefully that this movement is not a retreat from society. It is a deliberate decentralization.
Decentralization.
These men are actively building a parallel world. They are completely ignoring the mainstream culture war. They are refusing to ask for institutional permission or societal forgiveness. And they are quietly, methodically reestablishing their right to govern themselves.
It is an incredibly intense and sweeping thesis. I mean, the author literally traces a line from a college kid who cannot handle a polite debate through the pathologization of normal boyhood, the ideological capture of our legal and educational systems, right up to the construction of a rugged, off-grid, parallel society of men swinging axes and reading Plato.
It is undeniably a deeply controversial text, but it constructs a cohesive worldview that leaves us with a highly provocative thought to consider. Regardless of where you, the listener, stand on the ideological spectrum, the documentation provided in this book points to a reality we have to grapple with.
What is that final thought?
If a massive and continually growing demographic of men fundamentally distrusts the legal, educational, and corporate institutions of our society and is quietly succeeding in building a completely separate, parallel civilization, what does that mean for the future of our shared social fabric?
That's the real question.
Can a unified society actually survive when a massive portion of its historical builders simply decide to walk away, stop participating, and build their own citadel in the woods?
That is a question that will definitely stick with you long after you put the book down. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a fascinating look into a very different world.
It really has. As a final reminder, please be sure to like and subscribe to the show so you can catch our next analysis. We strongly recommend you check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to purchase the ebook Hysterical Harm. Overprotection creates mental illness. And don't forget to follow the author, at Conrad Reicher, at his Substack to read more of his unfiltered thoughts on this topic. We will see you on the next one.